Okay, whoa, suddenly the waiting room has been released. And here we are. I love it when I see everybody arrive. It's nice to see already some familiar faces. As ever, let us know if you want to where you are. We like to see if we've got that global coverage in the chat. Hi, Ian, how you doing? In and out, there you were. It's always interesting to see where people are coming from while everyone's coming into the waiting room for the virtual coffee, tea, or whatever they might be having, right? See if anybody else. Dubai, hello, hello, Southampton, wonderful. It's nice that people come from all over the place. Jersey, wow, very nice. I'm currently coming from unsunny Hertfordshire myself, as opposed to Martin. Sorry. Sri Lanka, Hong Kong. I love it. Liverpool. Isn't it wonderful that we can all come together and learn together and share our thoughts? I will be checking the chat as we go along. You're from Hertfordshire as well. Someone in there. Dubai, Huddersfield. Lots of people from Dubai today as well. That's always great. Your questions and comments, I will be checking in the chat. So if you want to ask them, if they come in a surge, then I can interrupt Duena. Otherwise, we'll hold them towards the end. Okay. And Tom, you're welcome about the equipment that I use. Apparently my equipment works well. I appreciate that somebody noticed that. And Duena, it's sunny in Essex. We're in the wrong place. Okay. Okay. We'll see.
Really?
That's it, right? Let's see. Okay.
In North London, that's sunny. We've not seen sun in days, so.
No, we're definitely turning the autumnal corner in the UK. Right. Okay. As I said, I'll be checking the chat, and thank you for joining us today because it's important that we talk about digital all the time. I'm obviously at LIBF. We launched the Digital Center for Banking and Finance, and we're always talking about fintech. And we talk about digital transformation, and we wonder sometimes what that really means, Newcastle training as well. But what we mustn't forget is the team, the humanity, the people, because often when we're talking about digital and digital transformation, we're talking about the negative impacts on people who work in banking and financial services, as in jobs being taken out, or us having some uncertainty about where we go, preparing ourselves for the jobs and the careers that don't exist yet. Right, we're always talking about it as something that we have to do. But actually today, when we delve into this, Duena is going to talk to us about psychological safety and teamwork in the digital age, because it isn't just about the tech. It is people before the technology. And I've known Duena for a few years now, and she's been a force in our industry in terms of helping banks and other institutions on their digital journey, but also realizing that the human element, the human debt, the courage that bankers and other financial service professionals need wasn't being addressed entirely. So Duena, before, I know you're an author, you're an investor, you're an educator as well. So before we get into what will be your webinar today, I just want to check with our audience as well and our cohort and see if people know, are familiar with some of the terms. Roxanne, can you help me with the polls? If we start off with human debt. So we're going to be talking about some terms today that you may not be familiar with. And Duena will explain them with great detail with some examples. So human debt is one of them. Okay. And it's a little bit going, can you see the poll, Duena, as well?
Lovely, yes, it's lovely seeing it live. Amazing.
Yes, it's like a horse race, isn't it? I always feel like I'm out of the races. No is definitely in the lead, isn't it? It's unsure. Yeah. Okay, we're good. So overwhelmingly, I'd say that we're some of us are unsure, some of us are no, and a few of us think we do. And then the other one is psychological safety, because you're going to be addressing both of these terms, aren't you? So let's see if we understand what that means. Psychological safety teams.
Already we meant psychologically safe, but there we go.
Yeah.
Team one. Oh, very cool. This is amazing seeing it live.
All right. So this is kind of a little unsure, maybe yes, maybe no in psychological safe teams. Okay. Okay. So let's see if as we're going along, this becomes clearer to you. And I'm going to, Duena, I know you're also going to talk about emotional banking, because that's something that was, early on in your realization a few years ago when you realized what we were missing and you started to help people with as well. So I'm going to hand over to you to take us on the journey. I'll be here checking the chat. I'll probably come in and out, add my 2 cents or 2 pence as we go along. If that's all right with everyone. Take it from here and share the screen.
Well, thank you so very much. Let me see that I'm not going to ask you guys if you can see my screen, because that's the most hated question in the universe these days.
Or are you on mute?
You can.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Exactly. Excellent. But thanks a lot. So it's not the intention that we do a set of slides really, but just kind of to give us some context and to frame us a little bit. We'll do that for the definitions and for my mini history of how I ended up having this realization, and then for the definitions. And then ideally they will only be a framework for us to kind of have a chat on top of it. So more than happy
Absolutely.
to answer any kind of questions. It's one of those topics that divides a room and people have very different lived experiences. So I fully expect people to be asking things. So let's get there first, right? So about me a little bit, you guys can find me on LinkedIn. It's really difficult to get intros in without sounding horrible. I hate introducing myself, but if you read a little bit about it, what I've done is had a really long time in banking, in particular fintech, since I would say the beginning of fintech. Grew a couple of companies, seen a few hundreds of banks from the inside out, became really up in arms about how they're not doing the right things. Wrote about it, made myself unpleasant in the fintech industry, and eventually a few years back kind of decided that I'm sort of done with fintech, if you wish. I'll walk you through that journey in a second. But these days, also on LinkedIn, you can find me writing not once, not twice, but 3 times a week for my sins. There are 2 different newsletters, and this will frame why this topic is important to us today and how they are 2 different sides of the coin, if you wish. So on the one hand, there's this newsletter called Chasing Psychological Safety, which is essentially a place where we talk about nothing else but the topic of psychological safety. What do we do with teams? How do we empower teams so that they do better by themselves, and so that we can actually deliver on the promise of technology. And then on the other hand, we have this other newsletter, I have this other newsletter called The Future is Agile. Both of them were once a Forbes column, which I then decided that I didn't have enough editorial freedom in, so moved them to LinkedIn. But as you can see, there are 2 different things, which is the problem. The fact that we have 2 different newsletters, 2 different sides of the coin, 2 different parts of the industry is an issue. But the bigger issue is that many banks don't even know that these sites exist. So let's get to that one. So the journey, if you wish. At the end of my fintech journey, or towards the end of my fintech journey, I had a realization and a great amount of indignation towards the fact that banks seem to all know kind of what is needed from a digital perspective on paper. You could wake up any junior banker in the middle of the night and they would tell you what the best digital wallet would be like. But what they didn't have, it seemed to me, was enough insight into their consumer and enough curiosity to find out exactly how their consumer felt. And I thought that was the reason why they weren't able to deliver on agile transformations, move faster, and create this common vision that it seemed everyone had. And so I wrote this book called Emotional Banking, which was going through the history of fintech, really the way I saw it, and it was also going through what I found in terms of various banks struggling, incumbent banks in particular, struggling with catching up with neobanks and finding ways to compete and so on and so forth. And all of it, while I was writing it, I had this nagging feeling that this is not the whole story. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until maybe halfway through that I had the moment that was an aha moment, which was, none of this is necessarily the fact that they don't care about how the consumer feels, or rather that is a problem. Without a doubt, banks do not spend enough time figuring out how consumers feel. But the reason they don't is not that they just can't be bothered, is because of these very heavy organizational issues, and because they have a very heavy dose of what I call human debt. And we'll talk about it in a second to give you a definition of what I arrived at. But also in the same breath where I realized that they have human debt, I realized that this is probably not a bank issue only. And if I learned anything over the last few years, is that it isn't a banking issue only. It's an incumbent enterprise issue, if you wish, and one that can become a startup and a scale up issue as well. It's a people issue in general. It's an issue for anyone who needs to deal in technology but hasn't been built from the ground up on a foundation of looking at people. So this last
Yeah.
other book, sorry, go.
Can I ask you a question? I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that in incumbents in large corporates, whether they're financial institutions or otherwise, they tend to be risk averse environments, and people are asked to do a lot, but not to given the space to fail or to be courageous. They have to it's almost an impossible thing to achieve sometimes, because you have to remain risk averse, but do something that is genuinely innovative or outside the box. Is that part of the journey?
It's part of the excuses.
Oh, okay.
I would not say it's part of the journey, because
very good.
It's part of what we need to discuss and unpack without a doubt, because yes, it's easier for companies that have started digital from the ground up. Yes, it's easier for companies that have, or carte blanche in terms of how they've designed their propositions and their people and their culture. Yes. And yes, it's easier in the same breath for companies that don't have regulatory demands on their heads. That said, there are plenty of examples of companies that do have extreme regulatory needs, and yet they have managed to foster curiosity and innovation and good teamwork and truly functional cultures that allow them to also be agile, also produce technology. And an example that I always bring to banks, because they just don't think about it, is actually the biotech and medical industry. Because if you look at the bigger guys that are, you've seen them in the last year and a half racing to the vaccine, but what we don't see is the fact that they are massive enterprises where they have the most regulation you can imagine. If we think we have a lot in banking, we don't understand what it's like to actually attempt to make meds for people's lives. And then they still manage to kind of keep the importance of their people and the fact they have to have innovation at the core. So it's not impossible. It's just a question of being a lot smarter in how you redesign your guardrails and then allowing freedom within them.
Super.
So in between these two books, I will admit from the get-go, I'm a bit nuts. This is a new tattoo I got 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
And yes, I know it's not very common. Let me tell you, my tattoo artist was absolutely shocked, and she insisted tremendously that I put more of those tickets in the middle in doing, so that we balance it visually. So I had to spend 2 hours explaining to her the concept of work in progress and the importance of being agile. I don't know if she got it or not, but she let me get away with only 2 of those. So I do have.
Well, Tom loves it.
I do have an agile fetish. So I should say this from the beginning. This is why I was so desperate to find ways in which we can all do better from that perspective. So I wrote this one book. I'm not one of those people that talks about things. One of my biggest pet peeves is for people to think that I'm a speaker and kind of I write and I speak. That is totally not the day job. The day job is I make software, I run a team, I run many tens of teams, but we make software, so we make something. It's really important to me that what we do is fix things and not talk about things. And it's something I know all of us here have in common, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I will go very slightly over what the software is later, just to give you a general idea, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is we are trying to find exact ways to make more of this psychological safety thing, because we believe it is important, right? But back to what I was saying, the moment of aha, right? The human debt and what it is. So human debt is the equivalent to technical debt. So anyone here who has a tech background, anytime wrote a line of code, you guys are familiar with the fact that anytime you write code, you run the risk or to essentially start creating technical debt. Anytime you make architectural decisions, anytime you kind of make anything of a technical nature, you might not be making it to the absolute best, in the absolute best way, or at the best time with the best people. So what happens is it creates tech debt, which is fine, except from after a while, almost everyone who's made a technical product knows you have to go back to the drawing board, sometimes clear the slate and redo things just to kind of address some of this tech debt. Otherwise, you cannot ignore it forever. So human debt is the equivalent to tech debt, but for people. So if you look back at all these times that you see on the screen, I'll give you some proper examples in a second, but it's all of the things we should have done in an enterprise when it comes to our own people, our own employees, and we haven't actually done those things, right? And there's a lot of them, unfortunately. I have some examples in a second to give you. There's two types of human debt. There's human debt, I think, at organization, and I get to think about it because it's my term. So human debt at organizational level, and then there's human debt at team level. Really quickly, just to show how crazy I am, there's a TM there, not just because I'm very precious about it, but because Gene Kim, the guy who wrote Project Phoenix and Project Unicorn, the father of DevOps, if you wish, he said, this resonates with me so much, I would have loved to see a trademark after it. So I went and got it. If Gene Kim can do anything, you do it. So there you go. So essentially, human debt at organizational level and at team level, like I was saying, at an organizational level, as you see on the screen, anytime we've had work done on people work, or projects that have been started and abandoned, when we had a lot of saying things in the newspapers that weren't really substantiated internally, when we changed management in rapid pace without people knowing where people have disappeared and whether they're alive or not, we see a lot of that. Bad leadership, and that's such a big encompassing term, right? It can mean many things, but to me, it means in particular command and control, like we're going to say in a second. Friday initiatives, right? That's essentially an umbrella derogatory term to encompass all of the things that we think are fluffy and slightly unimportant, and we kind of discuss if we don't have anything more urgent. All of that, considering the important people work as being a Friday initiative, is creating human debt. When we have big topics that we've left unclear, right? Your employee happiness, your ways of work, your D&I, all the bigger ones that are just not crystal clear to everyone in the enterprise, all of that creates human debt. When you have surveys that are sterile, once a year asking people, would you recommend this place of work, is not asking them how they feel, is not cementing a relationship with them, it's not really asking them anything, and it's upsetting to kind of just throw something into the abyss and not have anything returned. Worse off, there are the next one, which is punitive act, which comes sometimes from those same surveys or other surveys like them, where you do get asked, and instead of the nothingness and the silence afterwards, something bad happens. Or that creates something called now survey fatigue, which is a general thing that many people have, where they don't feel like they have any interest in engaging at all with the company. Okay, culture of fear and avoidance of failure, which is something that Helen has touched on already, and just the crux of this issue. When we live in a place where we're more fearful than we are daring, when we are convinced that if we fail, it's an issue, all of that kind of mentality, that mindset is what's holding us back. When that allows toxic politics, it makes us stay silent. And as I said earlier, having command and control, big topic. I could talk about that for years. And then paying lip service to agile with no mindset change is a big one. And then obviously unhappy and unengaged employees. But all of those are at an organizational level. Here's the problem. There's human debt at the team level as well. And if you cast your eyes down the list, the last one over there is blaming the organization, because the other slide is telling you how horrible the organization is, and it's done all of these things to us. But realistically, we have to take some personal responsibility at the team level because we've done some of these things to ourselves. So some of this human debt has happened and is perpetuated at the team level. And these are the bits we can and should work on, right? Impression management, I'll talk about it in a little bit again, but to give you a general definition, it is essentially the negative side of a psychologically safe team. Meaning anytime that you don't feel ready to apply yourself, to open up, to say something, to have an opinion, to speak up in any which way, anytime you bite your lip, anytime you stop yourself from engaging because you're afraid of something, that is when you're impression managing against someone perceiving you either as incompetent or ignorant or negative or disruptive. If you have that fear and that stops you from engaging with your team, that is impression management. It's incredibly damaging to a team. It's a behavior we can learn to understand and then diminish as we learn about it. Then all the times that we have tension, but we hope will just kind of go away by itself. And let's face it, that's very common, right? Or when we witness people not being treated fairly, we didn't say anything to help them. When we were having these big topics, but we kind of like, this is not the time, the organization hasn't really told us we should discuss the bigger ones, we don't have mandate, we won't touch them. When we know, this is really important, when we've canceled people work, right? Whether it was a team relaunch or a team building exercise, how many times have we been in a situation where we meant to do them, we had good intentions, but then something important, quote unquote, came up, we just canceled it or postponed it. That creates human debt. Anytime we've had failures or mistakes, and instead of taking the opportunity to transform them into a learning opportunity, we've pretended they never happened. That creates human debt. If we, as I said, deprioritize the human work in favor of delivery, that's a serious issue. When we avoid one-on-ones, and let's face it, many of us have, even if we know we have to, the lack of investment in an emotional bond with our team, part of it, lack of EQ training, this is incredibly big and incredibly common, right? We've all worked in places where, not in places, all the places we've worked on with have kind of had this general mindset of you come over here for your knowledge and you come over here for your expertise. No one needs you to have EQ. Which is obviously false. That isn't how leadership goes. That's not how teamwork goes. We do have to have EQ. It's incredibly important, in particular these days when the ways we work in which we work together need us to understand our emotions and the emotions of others. Yes, so you get the point. Anytime that we treat the human work as less important than things we need to do, when it's not on the to-do list, that's when we create human debt at the team level. And none of these things have to wait for the organization to tell you to do them. These are things we can do ourselves and the team can do as well. So what can we do to reduce this human debt thing? There are a couple of big themes that are returned to a couple of times as we talk about this. One is organizational permission. Obviously, in the perfect world, every organization would be smart enough and woke enough, I'm not a big fan of the term, to say, right, I've seen the light. If I want to compete with the likes of Google, I have to, or whatever, maybe not Google is a bad example, Netflix, then I have to rethink the way I look at my own people. I promise you, I'm serious. Put this work first and everything else last. Here's money, here's time, here's permission, right? That would be amazing. But we don't all live in places where the organization said that. No, most of us don't. So few and far between as they are, it's worth it that we find the ones that do have organizational permission and then make an example out of them so that other places feel courageous too. Then data and actions, incredibly important that we find ways in which this human conversation is not a fluffy one. We cannot leave it as we all agreed here, we had the moment of magic and oh my God, we totally agree. And then we go home and nothing happens, which is to a degree why I make software, is because software helps you, drives you, and helps you see data and take action. Whereas if you just talk about things, no matter how magical a moment, they're fleeting moments and we're not going to get very far. I think that human debt has to be treated as tech debt. And then finally, lastly, and most importantly, we have to focus on psychological safety. The reason for that is once you see the definition and you connect with it, I think we'll all start to agree that it's not the only thing that needs to be done in an enterprise, but it's the most efficient way to start changing things and chipping away at this massive human debt we've given ourselves. So far, so good. Are we clear on the human debt topic? Cool. Shall we go into psychological safety or? Yeah. Cool. I'm just mindful to kind of be sure that we run through everything. So really quickly, the definition of psychological safety, the dry academic definition is psychological safety is a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. That's what Professor Dr. Amy Edmondson says. We've taken that definition, I think made it sound a little bit more human, if you wish. So a psychological safety means one that feels like family. And I've seen more eyes being rolled back than I have money in the bank about the topic of team being like family, because people tend to immediately go, ah, you don't know my family. But in all honesty, no matter what your family is like, that is exactly the feeling we would like you to remember when you think of a team where you felt that way. And if you look at high performing teams, your Navy SEALs, your so on and so forth, they all describe their teams as being like family for a reason. No matter how dysfunctional, it's a place where you can truly trust the other individuals in a group dynamic. So if you think back of the last time that you were making magic with a team, those when you were open, when you were debating vulnerable learning, all of that, right? And when it felt fun and it was like a well-oiled machine, that was a psychologically safe team. Some of us are lucky and we can think of back to last week or the last retro and go, oh my God, these guys are my family and we are making those amazing things together. Most of us are potentially not. We don't yet are not right now in a psychologically safe team, in particular after the events of the last 3 years. But we are all able, I can almost guarantee, to remember at least one time in our lives when that was the case, right? So it's a really worthwhile exercise to ask yourselves and your teams, if you want to take any of this to your teams, ask them to close their eyes, take 5 seconds, and remember a time when they were in a psychologically safe team. Because once that emotional connection to the topic is done, it's a lot easier for us to kind of look at the science together, and this is what we're doing now. So psychological safety has been studied by academia and business alike. To be honest with you, until such a time that Google touched it, business didn't know it existed, right? So despite the fact that this lady in Harvard has spent her entire life dedicating her life at studying, furthering the studies on psychological safety, it wasn't until Google did this famous thing called Google's Project Aristotle that it truly took flight. This was a few years back. So what they've done in Project Aristotle, I don't know if people are familiar with it, maybe you are, is they've asked the question, what makes our Google teams highly performant, right? They already had done a leadership study, what makes our leaders highly performant, but what makes our teams highly performant? And they had an immense set of variables, the biggest I've ever seen, despite having done this for a living in the last few years, which is they were asking anything from, is it because of our selection process, because of what we pay people? Is it because they can nap at work? Is it because we have more people that are Pisces than we have people that are Aries and so on? So they have went through every variable you can imagine, right? And what they came back to over and over again consistently over all of these teams in 4 years are these elements that you see in front of you on the screen. So if you go from the bottom up, teams that are highly performant feel like they are making an impact. Teams that are highly performant have meaning. They believe it means something to them, what they're doing, right? So purpose, if you wish, and impact. Then a really important element of that is structure and clarity. Do people feel like they have clarity in their roles and plans and goals? That is maybe the only one there that's very organizational. Very little we can do at a team or individual level to instill that structure and clarity. And organizations that don't have structure and clarity are likely to fail no matter what they're trying to do. Dependability, which is more of an agile, if you wish, plus Google sort of term. But the one thing they came back to over and over again, and that is not disputable, it's not their own term, it's not about ping pong, it's the notion of psychological safety. And it is when Google put it up there that kind of the business world, in particular the technology world, has kind of woken up and said, right, what is this thing and how do we get more of it? And this is really quickly part of what we've done to kind of further the work, which is we spent a good half a year and £1 billion, I don't even necessarily want to quantify it, figuring out what are the components of psychological safety. Because while we all connect to the topic, just having it as a black box of things that are useful is not good enough, right? So as I said, I'm a doer, give me the thing we need to change. So we spend a lot of time splitting it into the components and the behaviors that can make a difference. And these are them. Teams that are flexible, engaged, speaking up, courageous, resilient, and they learn together. And it's incredibly important one way or another, even if you don't have software like ours, do this yourself. Start understanding if you have those things, and then start understanding ways in which you can do something about those particular behaviors, right? So that you close this feedback loop and you can start seeing results, right? So again, behaviors that we found are good behaviors, speaking up behaviors, these ones where you open up, you bring your whole self, your every idea, your every observation, and you're vulnerable and you're emotionally connected. And then the negative ones that I've mentioned earlier, which are the impression management side of things, when people are not speaking up because they don't want to look bad practically and that their team members think of them badly, right? And again, if you have software like ours, you can measure when they do that. If you don't have software like ours, keep an eye on it. There are ways to kind of start understanding what that behavior is like. You'll start seeing that trigger. You can stop yourself and stop others from doing it. Right. So I'm sure you guys see this all the time. And you look, even those of us that didn't know about it have then felt it on their own skins. There's nobody on earth who doesn't unfortunately know what it means after the pandemic. But in our case, right, in technology, it's more scary than anywhere else. And this is like a slide that I am open and honest about the fact that I use it to scare not only you guys, but myself. Because if you look at what's happening here, this is how fast things are going, right? This is why we have to have agile. This is why we have to have teams that can do agile. It's because things are moving this fast, right? It took us, 28 years to get credit cards, ATMs 18, whatever, mobile phones 12. WeChat took a year, but the most scary of all of them is how Pokemon Go took 19 days to get to 50 million users. And I don't care what company you work for, there's a Pokemon Go out there to get your lunch, despite kind of how we can cognitively dissonate from it and go like, yeah, maybe not me, maybe I'll be safe. So this is how fast technology is moving. We got to do something. As I said, Silicon Valley is betting on psychological safety for teams to get them fast enough, to get them agile enough, to move fast enough. But it has other if you wish, there's other ways to build a business case around empowered teams as well, right? Those teams are not going to leave. There's a 30% reduction in turnover in times of peace. Not anyone has checked what this means in a post-COVID great resignation time. I'm presuming this effect is doubled, if not more than that, simply because what we've seen with teams that we work with in all industries is as soon as they start to work on the human work, as soon as they start seeing data and doing something about it, that alone, the fact that they're working together on their team and on their dynamic has a cohesive impact in a sense that they've never seen before. Team members that were about to leave stay. Team members that were disengaged become engaged. It's just it's human nature. All of a sudden you're working with your team on becoming better, right? Then of course they become more productive and there's less safety incidents and all that. Right. Before we go back to just questions, look, all of this is hard, right? Soft skills are hard. Talking about human bits is hard. No one likes to do it. That's why I personally advocate we need software, because that's so much easier. Again, it doesn't have to be ours, but like ours, make sure that there's data, because once there's data, people have less of an ability to kind of give you the excuses of why they won't do the human work, tell you why it's hard and so on. So find some piece of software to anchor your efforts on. But once you do, make your work on the team dynamic a habit. Because if it does become a habit and it's one of your tickets, right, or one of your to-dos, this week I need to write a presentation, or I don't know, this week we need to kind of write more code in these user stories, and we also need to get this team action together so that we have less impression management. Whatever it is that you're doing, it has to become one of your normal to-dos together as a team so that you start improving the dynamic that you have together. So there are very, very clear things that can be done. Both of those newsletters that I was talking about are full with like, please do this sort of ideas that you can please nick from them. And then like, forget our software, just kind of do it manually if need be, right? And just keep being flexible, keep measuring, and make sure you measure quote unquote for the good and not just to scare people off. Keep learning. You guys know these things, they're not news, but we just have to kind of it's almost a daily type of job to remember that they're important. Resilience, which comes from having done all of these things. Servant leadership, as I said, big topic. The opposition between what used to be and what is in terms of command and control and servant leadership is staggering, and it's important that we understand it. Look at your top, figure out if they have psychological safety, And importantly, figure out if they have teams whatsoever, because what you'll find is the higher up you go, the more there's work groups and not actual teams. And that can really, really harm you. So if you look at the Netflixes and stuff, they have true teams at the top, like real teams that are tight, working together, truly helping each other. There's no departments that come in to tell each other how they've done. So, and then obviously be courageous, look out for impression management, obsess with psychological safety, and treat the human data as second. Yep, that's all there was to it. I waltzed through them real fast so that we can answer things, because I can see that there are things, but I don't know what they are.
I was on mute for a minute there. Thank you very much, Duena. You're right. There is a lot in there, isn't it? Right. Let me just make sure. Okay, Tom, thank you very much. See if go back a little bit as well on myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so actually, we're saying here, somebody is saying it's constructive communication with empathy is vital to build trust, and that's what they do in their practice in Regent's Park as well.
Really, really important point to make here. I don't know if I made it earlier, but I think it's worth it. There's an exact equal sign being put between psychological safety and trust often, and that's understandable. That said, psychological safety is not trust as we remember it between two individuals. It's a team level dynamic, right? It's group dynamic. So if you think of trust as between A and B, this is trust between multiple moving parts. And because of that, it's incredibly fragile and it changes with very small inputs. That's why it's crucial that we keep an eye on it all the time, and not just kind of, it's not going to work doing it once a year or once a month.
Duena, how is, and I'm actually thinking, so if you're working in an organization where you think that some of these things or all of these things could be improved to be better, but you know that the emphasis is on the bottom line, it's on implementing an accelerated digital transformation because of what's happened to everybody in the last 18 months, you know, to retain a position or to be competitive or still be there going forward. How do you start to breach? You've mentioned a few areas where you can build the business case for this. What are the ways that you can start to bring it up and breach the subject without looking like you're saying to everybody, oh, let's, you know, we're all going to trust each other and love each other and it's not going to have any impact on the organization? And you know, do you know what I mean? And you come across as if saying, where are you? We're in banking and financial services. I know what you're saying. And I think it's also really, we've said it, you know, in quickly and in our discussion, but actually that team group dynamic of trust is not so easy, I would imagine, to achieve. I've been very fortunate once or twice in my life to have that, but that's a long life of work. And I could see how the benefits played out in our bottom line, in our reputation, in the content that we produced, in the way that people wanted to stay working with us and they felt that there was a career progression. But someone had to come in, and by someone in this case, it was me, someone had to come in and say, this isn't good because these people feel uncertain and they feel like they're here in the short term and they're behaving in a way that's not helpful for us or for our customers. Yeah. So how is that first opening? How do you start that conversation if you're not in a place? We've, you know, both of us have experienced, as you said, hundreds of banks in this discussion. And I'm sure we have people with us who are working in some of the larger incumbent organizations. How do we start the conversation?
Very good question. The reality of it is psychological safety is not a nice to have. It's not a morally good idea, right? It's not because we're nice to each other. It's because it does have an actual impact on the bottom line. And that number is, yes, we saw some numbers, the way kind of it reflects in retention, which is a big, sufficiently huge business case. And there are numbers around, you know, safety and so on. But I think the more interesting numbers are, for instance, Google has an internal number, 40% more productive their high performing teams are. 40%, that's 40% more money they're making them. It's that kind of clear cut. It's the biggest and greatest thing that any kind of technology driven place can do so that they actually get their bottom line higher. But also I spent a long time when I wrote the last book trying to put a bigger number on it. My obsession was and still is to a degree that agile was put on earth by the god of technology, so that we can actually show how important it is to have people that are able to have that type of chemistry in a team, if you wish. That sounds horrible, and I normally don't say that, but it's the truth. So I spent a long time trying to research that, because my conviction was, and is, and I've seen it, I've seen anecdotal places where you have higher throughput, you have lower defect rate, you have lower garbage code, you don't create as much technical debt, you don't have long sprints that become epics with work in progress. There's a large number of direct KPIs of agile transformation projects that are directly connected to whether or not that team functions that way. And in fact, teams that are starting to now measure it with the team, hundreds of teams we work with right now, they are starting to see that correlation be incredibly quick. It's almost like a heartbeat. As soon as they get more impression management, their throughput drops. As soon as, and it stands to reason, they don't open their mouth, they don't say what the problem is, they start making mistakes no one sees. And obviously they're not going to be delivering on their tech work. Or as soon as their flexibility drops, then they're less willing to be testing, and their agile cycles are starting to slow down. You name it, there's very clear correlation between agile KPIs and having psychological safety. In fact, I don't actually think you can have a technical organization that's doing agile whatsoever if you're not mindful of how the dynamic of the team works. People still try, but any CTO and any DevOps specialist worth their salt has noticed that it doesn't matter what pipe you put in place. It doesn't matter what cloud provider you select. What matters is that this team actually functions in a way that allows them to be agile.
Very interesting, because we often disassociate the tech from the human and how the team is interacting and how it affects the tech delivery. Forget about everything else in terms of the bottom line. And if it's good enough for Google, it's good enough for me. A couple of questions. Can psychological safety emerge from within an organization, i.e. from one team leading the way, or does it have to come from the top down?
Absolutely can. The 90% of all of our clients have started with one advocate somewhere. Let me tell you, let me let you into a secret. 90% of digital transformations in banks have come from, you can normally boil them down to this one dude and then the people he has managed to cohese around them. Helen and I know a few of these. I think in my emotional banking book, I actually named a couple. Alessandro is one of them, for instance. He single-handedly changed things in Lloyd. It's irrelevant, but the point I'm making is it almost always boils down to one person, one team, one advocate conclave where people have made things happen. Does it sometimes in places it should be kind of those people are at the top, and that makes it slightly faster, but they can be in almost any level of the organization, in particular because this is what the beautiful thing about it is: the human work, the people work, the things we need to do to make our team better, right? The actions we need to do together. They are addictive. People will give you immense amounts of resistance at first. You're going to have your entire team of developers and researchers or whatever accountants go, that's not me, I don't know about that, let HR fix us. And the vast majority of them are going to say no at first and dig their heels. Once you get over that and they get stuck into the human work, it is literally addictive. When they start seeing results and they start seeing that their lives are better through something that they have done themselves, they become mini psychologists and they undertake more and more of it, and it spreads like wildfire to other teams. So
it needs a catalyst in some ways, as you said, right? And then that the proof is in the pudding. And for the rest of you, Alessandro is my co-author of the book and someone Duena and I have worked with before, and he was part of digital transformation at Lloyd's, or led that. So more questions. In treating human debt as tech debt, what are the levels of human involvement in the process? What checks and balances can be put in place to get the best results?
I would say this, because this is what I live and breathe and what I do. You need again, if you have our software, great. If you have something else, make sure that it does the following. It looks at it consistently. So you ask all the time. So if you want to ask all the time, you got to find ways in which that tone is not annoying, it's not grating, it fits into people's lives. It's a lot of work that goes into finding a way to open that dialogue channel, right? So that's your number one thing. Number two, when you find something out, it needs to be for the entire team. So the kind of visual representation that you were seeing on that dashboard, that has to be open to everyone, and everyone has to be involved in changing those coordinates. Number three, to a degree, it has to be live. The way this changes, like I said, is incredibly fragile. It changes on a sprint basis, on a weekly basis. Anytime some email flies around that has some undertone, anytime there's a rumor, anytime someone wants to leave, anytime someone doesn't put their camera on, you name it, there's so many ways in which teams can start imploding again instead of expanding into speaking up, that it needs daily kind of work, right? So this is the best way that you can actually drive this, is by having enough clear visual data no one can dispute, and it is ever changing, that people can build their own betterment on, if you wish.
Actually, it's interesting, Duena, because in another part of financial services at the moment, when we look at vulnerability, and we're talking about vulnerability and the regulations coming down from the FCA, one of the key things about the data that we're measuring to create those vulnerability scores and scripts, if you like, is that it's holistic and that it's live, and it's not what happened last month, because my behavior last month is not useful right now when you're determining how you treat me on this daily basis. And because it's going to be regulated in this country, at least pretty soon, people are starting to pay attention to it. And I feel a little bit saddened by the fact that we need the stick to be able to get people to behave in a certain way. But all of us of a certain age will remember post-financial crisis, the 2 years that followed it were the time that people were vulnerable, and we were much more aware of our emotional environment. And we seem to be trying to head that off at the past this time by looking at it now. We've got a couple of other questions.
Sorry. In fact, the FCA, that's something I forgot to mention, because I don't always talk to financial institution people anymore. But the FCA is being very smart and proactive in terms of psychological safety. Less so over here to a degree, but if you look at the Australian FCA, they spend almost all of their time on internal banking employees. How do they feel? What do they feel? Are they capable of producing technology that's both upholding standards and upholding regulation? So it's a really big topic, and yes, it's sad that it needs regulating, but if the regulation is don't be silly, do some of this, then it's probably not a bad thing. So
I have to agree with you. And also, I am a believer in regulators as being part of the innovation journey, positive most of the time. Second question from the same person. In the emerging VUCA world, what can be done to make use of the mechanics of speak up versus impressions management in analyzing good and bad behaviors for data collection and solving the challenges?
Like I said before, and I feel bad saying this over and over again, it just takes, we have an algorithm, for instance. You're going to need something akin to this algorithm to analyze how these things are changing all the time and how they are interconnected. For instance, if you remember those categories in which you should probably measure the good behaviors of speaking up, so flexibility and so on and so forth. So they each mean different things. For instance, courage is not the same thing as speaking up. You're going to have teams that are courageous individually, but put together they don't open up to each other. Flexibility feeds into resilience, but it's not the only thing that feeds into resilience, but long-term engagement feeds into resilience. And speaking of engagement, something I didn't even touch on is the fact that we use engagement wrongly in every industry these days. We seem to think that just recommending a place of work is engagement. It isn't. What is engagement is the emotional bond between the team members. And that's a thing you need to keep an eye on. That's a thing that you should increase, and that will then result into resilience. So my point is, it's a complex amount of human behaviors. It's not an easy thing to decipher, but once you have deciphered it, and again, some of this can be done manually. It's a lot better that you do it with pen and paper and goodwill than not at all. Is it going to carry you through for the rest of your days? No. One day, absolutely everyone in this conversation would have had their Jira or their Trello or whatever they keep there to do on the one side, and then something like us on the other side to tell them why those things have happened. So undoubtedly in the future, you're going to have this type of data readily available one way or another. The question is, are you going to be one of those companies that kind of wasn't even there when Slack was invented and they were still sending pigeon information? Or are you going to be kind of having worked out why you should have had it in the first place?
It's interesting. Actually, again, I'm reminded of sporting teams and we use them as the kind of, you know, outside of the box example of how teams work together well, how you need to trust. You mentioned the Navy SEALs. We can see examples in other parts of the world, and then we might see someone from sports world come in as a guest speaker at a finance event, and then we all kind of forget what they said, and we just go away and think, well, that was impressive. I got my, you know, my autograph, and I don't actually remember how that all kind of played out. But there are lessons to be learned in other lateral team kind of organizations. Ian, your question. Oh, sorry.
Very true, Helen. Sorry to, before we go on, teams are teams are teams. And I
Mm.
get this a lot, like, but maybe it's different in my industry. No, it isn't. Like, not at all.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's different for my culture. Also, no. Like, as long as you boil these things to human behavior that's common to humans, the only common denominator is being human, not being in the financial industry or from a certain country.
And I think financial services has learned a lot from other industries when we think about the way that we market to people as well, from the retail sector or from e-commerce. You know, we've also learned a lot about that. A couple more questions. Oops, let me go back to Ian. Ian had a question. How do you maintain psychological safety in a high-performing team when the teams are now working remotely, having all worked in the same office prior to the pandemic? That was one of my questions as well, Ian. Is there a different feeling to it that we've all been remote now, and how do you maintain that safety?
Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. If we think it's a vibe in the team, and we're talking about teams that had been together for a long time and they already had a groove and they were making tea in the office in a certain fashion, then to a degree, maybe yes, they might have struggled with kind of transporting that to virtual, I suppose, at the very beginning. But that is maybe the only fringe case that I can think of being the case, right? Because everybody else works in and always has worked in distributed teams, or not always, but over the last 10 years has worked in distributed teams or in cross-functional teams, in teams. Whether we were calling them that or not is a different topic. Whether we were admitting that we were part remote to begin with is a different topic. But realistically, most of us have worked in situations where we have had to contend with this distribution of people in one way or another, right? So I don't actually buy that a lot has changed. A lot has changed on paper. A lot has changed from the point of view of, if I'm an organization, everything changed. If I'm an individual who was going to the same office every day for the last 20 years and stamping on the same paper, a lot has changed. If I am someone working in digital or transformation, not a lot has changed, because we always had people that were outsourced. We always had people that were living elsewhere. More so, we even had, and this is something that's a pet peeve of mine, oh, we don't know if remote works. But if you look at it, the higher up the chain you are going in banks, the more remote those execs were. So people were working from home, just not the likes of us. So I don't actually think it's a humongous difference, number one. Number two, in fact, the digital environment is an equalizer, and there are some minor rules that are worth thinking about. And we've advocated for a year that people sit down, and now they have the opportunity to go, what all are we doing here? How are we doing it together? Let's recontract, let's rehumanize potentially in a room and do what do we want to do, right? Because now every team has that liberty, whether the company has sanctioned it or not. Even bloody, sorry for the French, JP Morgan telling them to all come back would have allowed those teams the liberty to do their things as they wished until they were summoned back. So my point is, if you did sit down, did do those thinking, what are our outcomes? What do we want to see happening in our team? What is our contract at this level? How are we going to work together? That is the equalizing moment. And then again, there are some minor things that you probably should be mindful of. Like most teams that we work with have now understood on their own, without us having to tell them, that it has to be one remote, all remote. You cannot have an entire room and then one dude in Sri Lanka and he cannot even hear what's happening and you think you're a team. If that's your setup, then everybody else needs to be on video. So if over here we're what, 200 people, if 196 of us were in the same room, but 4 of us weren't, then all of us would have had to have been on video and with headphones, because that is the way to have a conversation. And so there are minor things that can be done. And once you do those, then you can start working equally on these dynamics that are so behaviorally independent of where you work, that it's even more the time to be working on the human work and doing the people work in your teams digitally.
It's interesting, isn't it, with this whole and the idea that you said of everybody being remote, one for all and all for one, as it were. And also, I work part of the time with a software house where most people are working remotely. Say 300 or 400 people are working remotely. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking we should probably build some of these KTIs into the service level agreements and into the contracts that we have, not just within the team, but with our clients as well, so that everyone in that extended team, because often you're working as part of a team with the client that you're working for, if you're delivering something in that space as well.
And brilliant point. We have to remember that the team is not the place where we had that tea for 20 years. The team right now, us, we are a team, right? Before you guys came on, the four of us thinking about how to tell you this, we're a team. Now we're a team. And then over your day, you come in and out of teams. And you engage into something called teaming, which is an actual term. Less important maybe for us working in technology and in digital, but incredibly important for like roadside assistance or medical teams. They have exactly 10 minutes to form a team and save someone's life. There are techniques that work for teaming there are absolutely techniques that work for people that are just sitting behind a screen and then having to do some coding on their own as well.
That is actually what I was, as you said that, this is one of the things, I don't know how other people feel, but this is what I'm thinking, that the learning from other industries, that's a classic example. You have 10 minutes to get together and figure out how you're going to save somebody's life, or less than that. I would love to think in financial services, how can we use some of these techniques? How can we start to deploy some of these techniques and get our own version of measuring, whatever it might be, even at an entry level base, to be able to stay constantly in charge of it. I think that's game changing, because I really feel that in all the digital transformations that I've been involved in over time, it's always about the technology and about the customer experience. I will say that from a fintech proposition in terms of the banks, you're always questioning the customer experience, but I don't know if we're actually really understanding and living it, because we're not part of the customer internal, external team. We're just thinking, what can we ask the customer about their experience as well?
This is why I keep saying over and over again, let's refocus around teams. There's very little thinking and talking about teams. There's a lot of talk about the organization, which is, to my mind, as useful as talking about Santa Claus, because it's just as important, it's just as clear of a thing, right? It's just as real as a unicorn or Santa Claus. They don't exist. So let's stop talking about the theoretical topic of the organization. And then there's some talk about the individual, but there's not at all enough talk about teams, because once you do start reframing around teams, you stop thinking of us versus them. And it's whoever in that moment is coming together with an intention to solve a problem. And that's what we need.
It's got me now. It's stuck. It's in my head. You're welcome, Gerald. It's in my head that I should start speaking to the people that are working with the customers about the front end development, for example, as the customers as part of the team. And someone has mentioned, Jennifer, you have a question around cameras. I personally find it rude to not put your camera on. What are your feelings about this?
Again, check in with each other. However many you are in your primary team, if you wish, have that moment when you're 110% honest. I don't particularly like being on camera. One of the questions we put out right after COVID in a stay connected packs, because all of the teams we were working with had the same reality, was I hate being on camera, or I'm constantly in fear of someone passing, or I just don't feel professional. But I feel like there's peer pressure for me to get my camera on. I feel like there's peer pressure for none of us to be on camera. You'll find people who are upset about the flip side of the coin as well. So I think there's no clear and fast rule. What there is have you had that conversation as to where you all agreed? And it might be that in that conversation some of you will never agree and you still feel like I'm the one that has to make a sacrifice, but that will be fine if you have had that dialogue on this is what us the majority are comfortable with. Can we persuade you to please have that camera on, or on the contrary, can we persuade you to never have that camera on? The only commonality I would say is that in a meeting everyone does the same thing, whether it's one way or another.
I mean, I get that, yeah, the consensus. And I think, Jennifer, part of your question comes from the fact that people feel that if the camera's off, for some people, they're disengaged, or they're making the tea, or they're, doing something else. When we teach, obviously we're teaching in small groups on the fintech courses, we find this as well. But we know some people are awake at 5 o'clock in the morning, and some people are still awake at 1 o'clock in the morning, depending on where they are in the world. And they may not have their full face or beyond their dressing gown on, so they don't turn on the camera all the time. But it does impact the dynamic if there's a mixed bag that's going on. And Ian, thank you for I'm glad you're finding it thought-provoking. I personally am getting caught up in the thoughts that are going on in my mind about how to deploy some of these external from other industries as well in banking and finance in our world, not just to focus on the technology, but to also understand that everyone in the supply chain, the customer, everybody is part of the team, and we should make an effort to make us all feel safe within that team and find a way with tech or otherwise to measure it regularly and measure the things that matter. Because as you said, Duena, for Google, they could see that it made a 40% impact on the bottom line, but also it's just making it a nicer place to work. So actually, Peter says, whatever leadership did the human race have before the advent of technology? Yes, well, yes. And it has been, some people found it illuminating, which is wonderful. And I have as well. It's very interesting, Duena, because as I said, we met in the world of digital transformation as it was probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. And I think what the last year has taught us, and about some of the successes have taught us, is that it's not just about making sure that the code works. There's much more involved. And of course, at LIBF, we talk to people about their future careers. We're trying to help people have skills that help them going forward, or to get into a career. And we need to look beyond, outside the box. We need to look beyond what we've been looking at for the last 20 or 30 years as well. We've come to time. And thank you very much. Duena, can people keep in touch with you on LinkedIn if they want to?
Absolutely. Just add me. I'll do my very best to answer questions and so on. But if you wanted to collate questions and send them, that works as well. But just add me on LinkedIn, and I'm sure we can start a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And all of you know, you can find out more about what's happening at the centers on the websites. And thank you to everybody who joined us today, and for everyone who will watch it back later. Thank you, Duena.